Welcome to this webinar on reorganizing the federal data agencies. My name is Ken Poole and I'll be your host today. The webinar is jointly sponsored by the Association of Public Data Users, the Labor Market Information Institute, and the Council for Community and Economic Research. These three sister organizations have a common concern and interest in ensuring that policymakers and researchers have access to high quality data on communities and the economy, and that the federal statistical system receives the support it needs. And we spend a great deal of time with those networks ensuring that our voices are heard in Washington. Before we start our presentation today, let me go through a few logistical items. All webinar participants are in listen-only mode, but there'll be time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. If you have any questions for our speaker, feel free to type them in the questions box, which you will see in the GoToWebinar interface. You can submit questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll hold them at the end of the presentation, and I'll go through them and read them out loud to our speaker. Again, feel free to submit questions at any point during the presentation. So now we'll get started on our topic. Earlier this summer, the White House released its Government Reform and Reorganization Plan. Among the plan's many elements include one of special interest to our community, and it focuses on three statistical agencies. As many of you know, the U.S. statistical system includes 13 different principal statistical agencies, including the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The White House proposal would reorganize these three agencies within the U.S. Department of Commerce under the direction of the Department of Commerce's Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, which currently oversees Census and DEA. The Trump administration's rationale for the change is to increase cost effectiveness, improve data quality, reduce the burden on businesses, enhance privacy protections, and allow citizens an opportunity to gain access to data in a more effective way. Joining us today is Dr. Erica Groshen, who's a visiting senior scholar at Cornell University. She served as the 14th and most recent Commissioner of Labor Statistics from 2013 to 2017. And prior to joining BLS, Dr. Groshen was a vice president economist in the Research and Statistics Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Dr. Groshen's research focuses on jobless recoveries, regional labor markets, wage rigidity, and male-female wage differences. Dr. Groshen has also been very active in support of the statistical agency since leaving BLS. She chairs an informal advocacy network, the Friends of BLS, seeking to strengthen support for the Bureau. She's particularly well positioned, I think, today to provide us with background on the administration's reorganization plan, help us examine the rationale for this proposal, and explore how the proposal might actually benefit or impact BLS and the statistical agencies if it's implemented in an appropriate way. So this is your chance to provide feedback about your concerns. So as Dr. Groshen presents her thoughts and ideas, we'd encourage you to submit questions through the chat feature. And this will allow you not only to ask her questions, but to help us gauge what kinds of issues and concerns our community has. So at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Groshen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today to talk about this important proposal. I want to start off just by telling you a little bit about the Friends of BLS, which is a fairly new organization whose purpose is to support the BLS in its important mission. So it's free to join, and it gives you a way of keeping up with developments at BLS and also joining with other users of BLS data to support the mission of the agency. So I encourage you to Google Friends of BLS and sign up, and then you'll have the chance to sign on to letters that are sent to the Hill to find out about what's going on at the Friends, with the Friends, and also to suggest topics that the Friends of BLS should be working on. So I hope that one of the things that you do as a result of this conversation is to all of you join the Friends of BLS. All right, so what I want to talk about today is this proposal that, that the administration has put forth. And to do that, I think it helps to have a little bit of context about the BLS. Most of you know a lot about it, but you might not have seen the mission lately or know that much about the history. And I'll talk about the proposal itself and go from there into the rationale for the proposal and the conditions under which we think this would be a very successful transition. So what is the mission of the BLS? Well, the BLS is the second largest federal statistical agency. It was the first federal statistical agency formed, and it's responsible for measuring three large buckets: labor market activity, working conditions, and price changes in the economy. And to do this, it collects, analyzes, and disseminates essential economic information. And the whole rationale, of course, for having the BLS is to support public and private decision-making. And those of us who are data nerds, who love data, sometimes forget why it is we love data. But I think the simple reason is really very clear. We think it empowers us and other people to make the good decisions that we need to make in a free society. In a less free society, somebody else would be making those decisions for us. But we want decision making. Our country is founded on the concept that it is that we will get to the best possible solutions for ourselves and our families, our areas, if the decisions are made at as local a level as possible. And that is true to the extent that people at these local levels, whether they are in the private sector or the public sector, have the good information they need to make good decisions. So the BLS is really founded on that concept. That's why it exists. And it started, the first calls for the establishment of the BLS were in 1876. And only 8 years later, legislation that created the BLS was passed. And this BLS was, it was called the Bureau of Labor at the time. It was created in the Department of the Interior. In 1903, a new department, the Department of Commerce and Labor, was created. And what was to become the BLS moved to this new department. After only 10 years, the policymakers decided to split up commerce and labor, and BLS moved to the new Department of Labor. So BLS has moved around a bit since it was created. One of the reasons it was very important for BLS to move to the new Department of Labor was because in those days it actually had more of a policy role than it does now. Over time, it's become more and more clear that it's very important to separate policy making from data creation. And so over time, many of the things that BLS did in the beginning have been moved to the rest of the Department of Labor, leaving BLS to focus entirely on data. All right. So almost as soon as BLS was created, though, people began to say, well, but the data part, there's some real commonality between creating statistics, whether it's about the labor market or demographics or whatever. In particular, the census. While our country has been doing a census every 10 years, early on, the Census Bureau would actually be disbanded in intervening years. And around the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, it was recognized that the Census Bureau probably should continue to exist, even in non-decennial years. So when that was being discussed, the BLS commissioner at the time, who was the first BLS commissioner, said, yes, it probably could be a good thing to have the census office located next door, very close to the BLS, but he felt it was important for them to maintain a separate identity because their missions were different. Nevertheless, when the Commerce and Labor were split up, particularly because of these policy roles that the BLS had at the time, it was the decision was taken to move BLS into the new Department of Labor. Ever after that, people have those suggested that it would be better to have the statistical agencies together. And there's a very interesting book that's written by former BLS Commissioner Janet Norwood called Organizing to Count. And that details all of the previous suggestions for consolidating the statistical agencies, and in particular BLS with Census and BEA, and puts together a set of recommendations that she felt were the most compelling. She recommended having a national statistical agency that would be outside of the cabinet level, so it would not be in a policy department at all. And I think many of us think that that would be a fine idea. You can think of the recommendation of moving BLS into Commerce as perhaps a step in that direction, although it doesn't exactly, it would still have BLS and Commerce and BEA under a political appointment. Okay, the most recent proposal before the current administration was in President Obama's, was by President Obama, and that proposal actually asked for authority for President Obama to do a number of take a number of restructuring steps. So it was a proposal for fairly blanket authority, but one of the first recommendations that they make an example of what they thought would be really important was moving BLS into the Commerce Department. So it was up there starting in 2008. Now, when I became commissioner in 2013, I was asked, what did I feel about this, and would I be supportive of it? So the administration was still hoping that it would happen, but certainly in the 4 years that I was there, no steps were taken that I know of in that direction. So what does the new proposal look like? It came out in early June. It's called Delivering Government Solutions in the 21st Century. And if you look this up, pages 60 and 62 through 62 talk about this proposal. And here's exactly what it says. There's general agreement within the statistical community, the administration, and among private stakeholders that consolidating the three agencies would reduce public burden and duplicative practices, while simultaneously enabling a more coherent approach to developing the nation's principal statistics. And the reorganization would focus on the following goals, which Ken mentioned: increases in operational efficiencies, reducing respondent burden, enhancing privacy, and improving data quality and availability. So that is the proposal. And while there certainly are many other parts of this document, what I'm here to talk about today is only these pages 60 to 62. So, so what would this look like? On pages 60 to 62, there's not a lot of detail. The basic idea is to create a larger statistical agency within Commerce that would house within it Census, BLS, and BEA as continuing separate agencies. And the organization and the process is to be determined. Now, since then, Nancy Potok, who is the chief statistician of the U.S., she is located in OMB in OIRA. She's the head of the Science and Statistical Policy part of OIRA. And she's very much a proponent of this change. She has talked in general about what the timeline would look like. The first thing is that that the right way to do this is to have a very open process with stakeholders to inform the process and the outcome to ensure that this change will be beneficial to the stakeholders. So now through sometime in 2019 would be a period of time for stakeholder meetings to inform the process and the outcome. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Around 2020, then having done all of this outreach, collecting all of this input, then this would be the time to draft and pass the legislation. So that's find legislative sponsors, work on the language of the legislation and get it ready. Meanwhile, of course, the US Census will be doing the 2020 census, so it's not like this, it would be very easy for Commerce, the Census Bureau, to accommodate a major change like this before the 2020 census. And then implementation would happen 2021, 2022. So that's about as much detail as is available on what the process would look like and also what the outcome would look like. Let me talk now, then give you some more detail on the consolidation rationale. Why is it that Janet Norwood and any number of academic and governmental looks at the structure of the US statistical system has recommended consolidating the agencies more than they are now? The main rationale, of course, is to improve the products. So let's start with better statistics generally. Well, right now, as you know, most of you know, we have two separate establishment registers in BLS and census. This means that statistics that are created by BLS and by census are differ a bit because, in particular, because establishments in the two registers may be assigned to different industries. And also some establishments may be counted in one register and not in the other. Right? If the two agencies worked from a single establishment agency, then anybody who wanted to combine data from the two agencies would not have to deal with the fact that they come from separate establishment registers. If BEA and BLS were closer to each other, they could work to produce a more unified set of productivity and inflation measures. Right now, there's some duplication between the agencies. Some duplication will always be a good idea, but there's arguably in some cases more than is necessary. And that's the same thing with labor market statistics produced now both in census and BLS. So more clarity, more consistency is important. The agencies at this point have different access to data, in particular to IRS data. BLS, as most of you know, has no access to any data on an ongoing basis from the IRS. That's a real problem because, first of all, it makes for some inconsistency between the agencies, but also it means that they can't share information. When SIPC was passed, giving BLS access to IRS data was a main sticking point that was about to prevent SIPC from even being made into law. So it was taken out with the idea that this simple fix would be done sometime later. But 16 years later, the fix has not been accomplished. There is a lot of resistance on the Hill to BLS having access to IRS data partly because labor is seen as a fundamentally more political, partisan agency than commerce. And also because, for that reason, there's never been any access by any part of the Department of Labor to IRS data. Moving BLS into commerce gets over that hurdle. It would break no precedent for then BLS to have access to IRS data. The other part of this is that whenever agencies want to share data, they write MOUs between themselves. And frankly, the more distant the agencies are, the more difficult that MOU writing process is. So if BEA, Census, and BLS were all within commerce, the MOUs between those agencies would just go a lot faster and be a lot simpler. So then there's a whole list of efficiencies and synergies. I should have warned you, by the way, that this was really the money slide of the whole talk. Anyway, when agencies when different agencies within a department want to combine activities, they have to, particularly statistical agencies, they have to make sure that they're still respecting all the confidentiality promises and not compromising the independence of their agencies as they share things like IT services, HR services, licenses for software, hardware, things like that. And that is hard when and a barrier to sharing these background services, these kind of infrastructure services for BLS to share them with the other agencies within the Department of Labor, because it's very important to keep all of BLS data very separate and protected from the more political agencies and the programmatic agencies within labor. So therefore, BLS has not been willing and really not been able to take advantage of some of these synergies and efficiencies that would come from consolidating some services. Among the stats agencies, though, those concerns are, while still important, are less salient and less of an enduring barrier. Also, the statistical agencies just have more common needs amongst themselves. The skills that they could share are more similar with other statistical agencies. They certainly could focus on reducing respondent burden because they reach out to the same establishments with the same kind of promise. And there are opportunities to enhance confidentiality, IT communications, all legislative affairs, software licenses, all of these things that they hold much more in common than BLS does with, say, ETA or wage and hour or OSHA. So that's the purpose of doing this. And I think this case is quite compelling. However, anything that could be done well could also be done badly. So I think in particular, there are 4 things that we need to watch out for, those of us who are the friends of BLS. There's some things that we need to watch out for to make sure that should this consolidation move forward, and I hope it does, that it actually achieves the goals that I was just talking about. So there are 4 things here. First of all, it's very important that this not be a route to diluting statistical independence. You would not want this to be a means to reduce the objectivity of any of the 3 agencies. In particular, one of the steps that we at the Friends of BLS think is important for maintaining statistical independence is some focus on the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, who would be head of this new combined, sort of umbrella agency. We think that this should be renamed. Economic Affairs is too broad. This should be Undersecretary perhaps for Economic Statistics or something like that. Affairs connotes policy, and this agency should not be about policy. The head of this umbrella agency should be a fixed-term appointee, not serve at the pleasure of the president, and be a professional expert. Again, not a political appointee as opposed to a technical appointee. And then the chief economist for commerce, who now resides under the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, should no longer be housed in the unit with the statistical agencies. The chief economist should be elsewhere, probably in the office of the Secretary of Commerce, just like the chief economist for labor is in the Secretary's office at labor, because the chief economist is a policy position. Right. Another important element to watch out for is maintaining the BLS mission. This should not be a means to just dropping part of what the BLS has been doing. It has very important programs, and this, while evolution is important to maintain relevance, this step should not be a means to just somehow eviscerate part of the BLS. Along those lines, it's important to say that while an important rationale for doing this consolidation is to increase efficiencies, that does not mean that BLS funding should be reduced. As a matter of fact, BLS has had essentially flat, so declining real funding for a decade. And so this, it would be a bad idea for this consolidation to be a means to lowering the budget. And then finally, BLS is renowned among its stakeholders for having really good customer service. And the states, the Department of Labor agencies, and the Secretary rely on BLS. So it would be very important to emphasize that the services provided right now by BLS should continue and not be folded into some means of degrading the level of that service. So the bottom line here is that this consolidation is probably a really good thing for the BLS. For it to go forth and actually be as good as it can be, BLS will need your help. It's going to be important for everybody here to recognize and explain the potential benefits within your communities, but also to share insights, needs, and suggestions to OMB as it gathers stakeholder information. So that's going to be very important to make sure that somehow this doesn't become a Trojan horse. It'll be very important to vet the bill when it is written, again, to ensure that it achieves the stated goals. And then to be sure that if this bill is beneficial, that it can be resisted strongly. Or if it's not beneficial, it can be resisted strongly. But if it is beneficial, it can be supported strongly through the activities of the Friends of BLS and the rest of the organizations that help support the statistical system, such as APDU and COPAFs and other groups. So let me stop there. I want to thank everybody for signing up for this, and I look forward to answering questions and hearing your comments. Ken, are you there? Hello?
Hi, Erica. I have some questions for you that have come in from our audience. The first one is a general question that I'm going to go ahead and address. The slides will be sent out to all attendees after this presentation. You should receive them early next week. Our first question, though, to you, Erica, how do you, sorry, one moment. Scroll back up. I scrolled too far. How do you address the reasons why not to combine? And then they say that there are 5 main reasons that different data is collected differently: privacy, security, integrity, methodology, and popularity.
Okay, so the reasons not to combine. Let me talk a little bit about those. I think certainly if the consolidation suggestion had contained one of those poison pills that we're talking about, I think that those would be reasons to think hard about to resist the initiative. The other reasons I think could come from transition costs. So people might say, well, we're just moving the deck chairs around and it's going to cost money to accomplish this change. So there might be, so you might get some resistance from people who say that it's not worth it, or that it's going to be expensive. One thing to note is that certainly in the beginning, there's no reason to think that any agency, in particular the BLS, needs to move to another building just because of this consolidation. BLS has not been located with the Department of Labor while it's been part of the Department of Labor. So the move of where it should be physically located, I think, can be thought of as separate, and that's actually one of the most expensive parts of the transition. So I wouldn't focus on the transitions. If BLS has to move out of the Postal Square building, it will be because of some issue with the Postal Square building. Okay. The next reason that you might that people might oppose this is the home agencies might be might be against it or insufficiently supportive of it. And I think it's more likely that that labor would be resistant than commerce. After all, commerce gets a little bit larger, and generally agency, departments like to be larger, secretaries like to be larger, have larger purviews. So I guess it's more likely to be a problem either from the Department of Labor or perhaps some of the Hill committees that are used to supervising BLS. Now, I will say this could be in particular from the oversight committees, but the labor oversight committees do not focus very much on BLS. The whole 4 years that I was at BLS, I did not have any communication with the labor oversight committee. I never testified. I never talked to them. So I'd be surprised if there was a lot of resistance from the oversight committees, but it could happen. The Department of Labor would lose its second largest agency, so it would probably so it's probably it's likely that there'll be some resistance. On the other hand, the Secretary of Labor has indicated his support for this change. So it may not be enthusiastic support, but it won't be active opposition. The third important reason would be the one that I mentioned before, the risk of unknown agendas. So people might be reluctant to support this transition because they are overall suspicious of this administration, or of any change that, any change generally. So I think that those are the main reasons. Let me throw in a fourth one, which is that by and large, the statistical agencies are not front and center for most of our elected officials. They are not what they got elected to. They got elected to oversee. They generally don't pay much attention to the statistical agencies unless there is a big problem or things like congressional redistricting is in order. So it may be that this would get tabled just because of bandwidth issues. That was
Erica,
a long, yeah.
Sorry, Erica. This is Ken again. Sorry, my sound went out. Can you speak a little bit more about BLS's budget situation? You talked a little bit briefly during your presentation, and about sort of the situation in terms of the flat funding and what that's meant to the agency.
Sure. I actually brought along some extra slides in case that question came up. So let's go to this one. Here is the recent BLS budget history. The red line shows the budget in 2018 dollars. Okay, so this in current dollars. Sorry, in current dollars. So in 2009, the BLS budget was $597 million. And then if you follow that red line along, you see that there's essentially been no change in the BLS budget for 10 years. The 2019 number is what both the House and the Senate are proposing for the BLS for 2019. The blue line is what would have happened if, as of 2009, the BLS budget had increased with inflation. So you can see that a huge gap has been opening up, on the order of $120 million. Now there has been some, BLS has actually eliminated some programs, so you could bring that down a little bit, but you see that there is a very big gap that's opened up for the BLS, and that's made it very difficult for it to maintain quality and continue to produce programs. So why is this low funding happening? In this day and age of a lot of focus on partisan issues, you don't have many congressional champions focusing on public goods like economic statistics. And so BLS is in a situation of not having congressional champions because there are not a lot of moderates on the Hill who would prioritize this. And without champions, then in a time of austerity, which is what we're in now, you are going to get cut. There is certainly a fair amount of Hill dysfunction generally. BLS's activities on the Hill have all gone through the Department of Labor because that is the way the department wants to manage it. And the secretaries of labor have not prioritized BLS over the other agencies. That's their choice, but we see some consequences of that. And then we also have the classic public goods problem that the business community and the state and local government communities that rely so much on these data, hinge on it so completely, have not organized themselves to speak up effectively for the preservation of the data. So how's BLS been coping? It has eliminated programs, the mass layoff statistics, Green Jobs Initiative, and international labor comparisons have been eliminated. It has continued to find new efficiencies. It has made some small cuts to continuing programs such as Laos and OES. It has extended the vacancies of employees. It's cut training. It's deferred maintenance and upgrades. And it's delayed modernization of a lot of programs. Now, this points us in two directions. With certainty, if this continues, you will find increasing irrelevance And you'll also raise the probability of operational failures. Now, the BLS staff has been incredible in avoiding operational failures and maintaining relevance so far, but it's getting harder and harder and harder, and we're headed very much in that direction. And then I have a long list here of things that BLS would do with additional funds that are really important. The gig economy, using administrative corporate data better, upgrading its systems, providing more detailed and more timely data through OES and JOLTS, measuring employer-provided training, a number of things on the price programs, input price index to measure competitiveness and outsourcing, consumer expenditure survey improvements, and on and on and on.
So Erica, inertia is clearly a major factor in whether this goes forward. Many have reached out to us and said, well, we're not really spending a lot of time on this because we don't think it's ever going to happen, because we've been talking about this for a long time and nothing's ever happened. What role do you see going forward that Congress is going to need to play in determining whether or not this can happen? How can we make our voices heard on that part of the discussion?
Well, this will require legislation. Moving the BLS into Commerce will require legislation. And so Congress is going to have to write and then pass a law. And to do that, the stakeholders that various congressional, various people on the Hill listen to will need to speak up and to say, look, this is just getting more for our tax dollar. Let's do it. And that's the key thing. So stakeholders who have good relationships with people on the Hill are going to have to organize, and the groups like the Friends of BLS, like COPAFs, like APDU, and others are going to have to work closely with OMB to make sure that the right kind of proposal is put forth, and then work hard to get it passed. And it will take an effort unlike I've seen be successful since I got to BLS, but there's a rising tide now of interest in data. We are in the big data world, and if we can get the tech companies and the traditional companies to say, hey, this really matters to us, and the local and state governments to say, hey, this really matters to us, then my guess is you're not going to run into a lot of opposition, because frankly, it's a really good idea.
How does the recent announcement about breaking up and reorganizing the USDA's Economic Research Service influence your thinking about the proposed BLS move? And does that kind of environment help or hinder the need to the daunting task that you've laid out?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it's probably going to make people who care about data all the more suspicious of moves in this direction. But it probably, so I fear that the main reaction is, ooh, so my first reaction is, oh, this is not a good environment, not good news. On the other hand, I think we can make the case that, look, this is something that has long been thought to be a very good idea, and with the right kind of stakeholder outreach and support, then the case for doing it will be even all the stronger. And I think we need to make sure that it enhances the independence of the statistical agencies, and then that is clarified to to everyone on the Hill and to all the stakeholders that one major benefit of doing this will be to strengthen the hands of the statistical agencies. So I think it gives us an incentive and perhaps a way to argue for why this is different.
So is this leading us towards a model like some other countries have, where their agencies are pulled together? Stats Canada comes to mind as one model. And are there things that we could learn from the work that they've done, both in terms of what could go right and also what could go wrong if we were able to successfully move this forward?
This could certainly be an intermediate step in that direction, but I think it also is beneficial on its own merits. I don't have a lot to say about what the right things or wrong things to do if that were the proposal to just move it outside completely. I do understand that one danger of putting more eggs in the same basket is that then if you have appropriators who are angry at one agency, they might cut funding to the entire group.
Right.
So that's certainly a danger. And if you had a Secretary of Commerce who was not supportive of the statistical agencies, then you'd have one more agency affected by whatever the Secretary of Commerce did. So I do think that there are some risks, but there are risks with continuing the way that we are as well. And I think making commerce more of a statistical agency than it is now helps to increase the power of the statistical agencies in a department that is well thought of on the Hill, and that's not all bad.
Right. And you said earlier, I think, that some of the rationale here is because the Department of Labor has had a challenge in terms of its image on the Hill, while Commerce seems to have a much more sort of nonpartisan or bipartisan, really bipartisan sort of support in terms of its mission. But the agencies themselves, the statistical agencies themselves, each have a different mission that sometimes can be competing with one another. Can you sort of speak a little bit to that and how that might be addressed in this aggregation of the three agencies into one department?
Now, that's a good question. I'll start off by saying moving BLS into Commerce would not mean that BLS wouldn't have to fight fights and struggle with issues anymore. It would not be nirvana, but it would be a different set of fights and struggles, and ones that I think it would be better placed to succeed in. So let's see. I think for one thing, let me think about what the best way to address that. So a certain amount of duplication among statistical agencies is important for validation, and also so that you can combine information across different sources. So you would not want to get rid of all duplication. However, I think there are opportunities, particularly between the labor market statistics and the LEHD program, that those are the ones that come to my mind right now, and the OES, and to some extent and the NCS. I think there are opportunities for thinking through how to use alternative data sources, how to restructure some of the programs. They wouldn't happen immediately, but the possibilities would be there and much easier to achieve within the context of a single department. So, so I think it's just it just gives you the opportunity to try and rethink things, because BLS is not doing things now the same way it did when it was founded, and the census is not doing things now the same way as when it was founded. As they evolve, if they are within a single department, they are much more likely to evolve together and share the best of what each is doing and the best skills, as opposed to becoming more different over time, which is a problem for our users.
Yeah, data sharing seems to be kind of one of the issues at the core of the rationale, but also at the core of some of the concerns. And when I say that, one of the things you mentioned early on is the idea that that BLS doesn't have access to the IRS data. There's some places where BLS can share with Census, but Census can't share back. There's some oddities in terms of the different legislation, the different sort of rules and legislation that that apply. And then I'm going to sort of throw in another kind of wrinkle into that, which is sort of the state-federal partnership, which BLS has cooperative arrangements with the states to gain data. BLS has the same thing, but there seem to be on a different sort of, it seems to be easier between BLS and the states than it is between Census and the states. How do you sort of see that playing out, and particularly the data sharing concern and improving the data sharing, some of the key factors there, and then also the strength and changing nature of the state relationship?
No, that's a really good point. There are, BLS is working on a model MOU with the states for the wage record data. So some of the practices that BLS follows might be something that Census could adapt, or perhaps BLS could take over some of what Census is doing and fold it into what BLS is already doing. This just opens up the opportunities for that. But certainly having two different sets of MOUs written with all of the states is at least twice as much work as having one set of MOUs written with all the states, right? It's more work for the states, and it's more work for the statistical agencies. So I think inconsistencies and just deviations between the practices of the different agencies would be much easier to iron out and rationalize when they were working together from the same home organization. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for just rationalization, and we need to go in that direction because the states want better data, and this is a means to improving the data. I'm certain of that.
And in that data sharing, in the light of the data sharing issue, we do know that, for example, there's a lot of work being done in terms of modernization and whatever the phrase is, in terms of improving the information technology systems at BLS. Similarly, a lot of investments going on in terms of the IT systems at Census, and the BEA is sort of trying to aggregate those pieces together. Where do you see opportunities there? Are there some cost savings opportunities that might be particularly appealing to folks who, and are those cost savings a ruse to cut the budget, or are those cost savings an opportunity for allowing us to do some creative new stuff?
I think the stakeholders will have to remain active to ensure that actually improves things. But there are opportunities. Things as simple as software licenses. You get a better deal when you get a joint software license among 3 statistical agencies versus just each one buying them individually. The same with high-level statistical and IT skills. there are some lumpiness in these skills. It may be that you only need, for some of these skills, you only need one person doing it for all 3 agencies, right? Training staff, that can be shared in a way that amongst the agencies that right now is not. Some of the hardware, and certainly some of the research that goes behind modernization efforts, which also can be extensive. BLS has a network of establishment specialists in obtaining high response rates from establishments across the country, all right, and has not faced the kind of declining response rates that you see in household data. Through their expertise and their efforts, they've managed to maintain this. That may be very beneficial for the establishment surveys that the census does. Right now, they certainly have talked to people at BLS about this, but they haven't really taken advantage of this infrastructure that BLS has that's been so effective for BLS. So I think there are a lot of opportunities like that, and those get plowed back into improving the data. When BLS or Census, BEA saves money, they use it to improve. They use it to improve programs, because most of these programs have, we're lucky if the programs have flat real funding. Most of them these days have had flat nominal funding. So the only way to keep it going is to continually find these efficiencies and to keep pushing ahead.
So I have one last question, and you can't talk about a relationship between BLS, Census, and BEA without recognizing the I'm going to call it a political firestorm that Census is sort of grappling with right now, in preparation for the 2020 census. It takes a lot of oxygen out of the room. At the same time, it's also impacted the, even though that's the demographics program and census economics programs are probably the ones more directly related to what BLS does, it certainly takes resources away from those economics programs as some of the delays in the 2017 economic census have shown. And part of that is just basically there's only so much you can focus attention on. Do you worry that sort of cyclical nature of the 2020 of the census, the decennial census, could take away not only from the economics programs of census but also from BLS as well? Or is that something we just need to manage as part of this process?
Okay, so I worry. I do think that would be one of the things that then BLS would have to worry about after a move that it didn't have to worry about before. So there are going to be some new issues, right?
Right.
So, for example, when the Canadian, when some people in the Canadian government were upset by the equivalent of the Canadian equivalent of the ACS, they attacked the entire Canadian, this entire Stats Canada, right? So that's, this danger of being in one, having more eggs in the same basket. On the other hand, I do know that some of the infrastructure that the census has generally has been funded by expenditures that were necessary for the decennial census. So every 10 years, census gets a lot of money that it absolutely needs to conduct the decennial census, and it builds up an infrastructure that it needs for that, and some of it outlives the needs of the census, and so all of the programs benefit from that, whether it's a communications structure or IT expertise in facilities, and other sorts of investments. So so while there are costs to the air, this air being sucked out in favor of the census, and I have heard that from people at Census who don't work on the demographic component. There are some benefits to being associated from Census in terms of this infrastructure that's built up, that's then available for the other programs. So it has some risks, but it has some benefits too. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erica Groshen, for such an interesting and informative presentation, and to our attendees who have been providing some thoughtful questions along the way. We'd also like to say thanks to the leaders of APDU, C2ER, the LMI Institute, and the Friends of DLS, all of whom are working hard to ensure that data users have access to high quality and independent data. We will be making the webinar available, as well as the slides. We'll include the slides. I think a few people indicated they weren't able to get some of the later slides. We'll make sure you get those as well. And if you're not a member, please get involved with either the Friends of DLS, APDU, C2ER, or the LMI Institute, and help us help you. So thanks for your time today, and we hope to connect with you again soon at our next webinar.